So when we examine the land currently falsely so-called Israel, the first and foremost unavoidable problem is that the physical environment does not match the descriptions recorded in Scripture. Both the Torah and the prophets describe a land with immense forests, heavy rivers, snow-fed mountains, wide fertile plains, and large territorial distances that supported millions of people through long seasons. The modern Middle East simply cannot sustain the world that Moses and Joshua wrote about. For example, Scripture speaks repeatedly of great cedar forests, vast timber regions, and agricultural abundance that supplied both the local needs and the monumental building project of Solomon. Yet the Middle East and its surrounding areas today contain no such forests, and even its historical record cannot produce anything close to the skill required by the biblical narrative. The land is rocky, dry, and narrow, lacking the dense resources that the nation of Israel relied upon according to Scripture. Even earlier in Genesis, we are told that Noah constructed the ark from gopher wood, a tree uniquely native to the North American continent, and entirely absent from the Middle East, which means the very material God commanded for the ark had to exist in abundance in the world Scripture describes, not the world assigned to us by modern geography. And the Scriptures do not speak of timber lightly. The building of the temple, the palaces of David and Solomon, the storehouses, and the fortifications required not some simple scattered groves, but entire logging industries. We are told of caravans transporting beams across vast distances, of forests dense enough to conceal armies, and of landscapes where cedars and firs dominated entire mountain ranges. These descriptions imply a land of staggering forestry resources. But the claimed biblical region today is one of the most deforested and barren landscapes on the earth. Even while considering antiquity, there is no evidence that it ever held the vast timber reserves needed to support the world Scripture describes. The ecological record simply does not match the inspired record. In the Scriptures, we also read of David fleeing through forests, caves, and strategic high places, of armies navigating across broad valleys and mountainous terrain, and of fortified cities built across expansive regions. None of these patterns match the cramped, exposed, and resource-poor terrain of the claimed biblical region. The geography required for Israel's military history and daily life simply does not exist there. And the same problem appears with the mountains, because the biblical land is shaped by high elevations, snow caps, and meltwater that feed the streams and rivers of the region. Mount Hermon is described as a place of continual dew and seasonal snow, supplying water to the Jordan and the surrounding valleys. But the mountain modern geography claims to be Mount Hermon today is far too small, way too dry, and much too limited to perform the role Scripture assigns to it. The mountains of the Middle East simply do not produce the rivers, the climate, or the ecological diversity required by the biblical text. Another contradiction appears when we consider rainfall, because the biblical land received early rain and latter rain, seasonal torrents, and enough precipitation to maintain forests, vineyards, and a steady supply of flowing water. The claimed biblical region today receives nowhere near the rainfall required to sustain the kind of agricultural and ecological abundance Scripture describes. Without modern irrigation, desalination plants, and engineered water systems, that falsely claimed biblical region would entirely collapse. But Scripture depicts a land blessed with natural abundance and not a land dependent on modern technology to survive. The river systems present yet another impossibility. The biblical world includes a reed sea, freshwater deltas, deep river crossings, fertile floodplains, and agricultural waterways rather than the small seasonal streams found in the claimed biblical region. And here too, our modern assumptions collapse under simple investigation, because the word Nile never appears in the Israelites' text at all. The Scriptures use the following word, which simply means river or water course, not the name of a specific river, and certainly not the African Nile or African River, but more on that a little later in this video. The claimed biblical region truly has no major river capable of sustaining the events described in Exodus, Joshua, or Kings. What is told to us to be the Jordan is way too narrow, way too shallow, and simply incapable of supporting the large-scale migrations, crossings, or agricultural cycles mentioned throughout Scripture. Truly, nothing about the modern Middle Eastern waterways matches the biblical witness. And on a deeper level, this river problem affects agriculture much more so. Scripture describes the land overflowing with grain, vineyards stretching across valleys, flocks grazing on vast open pastures, and harvest great enough to feed millions year after year. Such abundance requires deep soil, consistent river systems, rich floodplains, and high water tables. But the Middle Eastern basin is dry, stony, and agriculturally fragile. Its soil cannot sustain such output naturally, and its rainfall cannot replenish the land in the cycle Scripture describes. Even the phrase "a land flowing with milk and honey" is ecological, and not simply poetic. Milk requires pasture, and honey requires flowering meadows, forests, and abundant vegetation. Yet none of these exist in the required scale within the claimed biblical region. The environment itself contradicts the written words of God. And the scale of the land contradicts the scriptures as well. The journey of Israel from Egypt to Sinai to Canaan require vast distances, multiple ecological zones, and long periods of travel that cannot be compressed into the tiny footprint of the claimed biblical region. In fact, the entire region claimed to be the land where the Israelites once walked can be walked across in a matter of days, and not months or years, which makes a 40-year wilderness journey not just geographically impossible, but also quite silly. The wilderness of Scripture is a massive region containing countless encampments, diverse terrain, and enough space for a nation of about 2 to 3 million people to wander for extended seasons. The Sinai Peninsula simply does not possess the size, the resources, or the environmental distinctions needed to sustain such a journey, if we take the words within the Scriptures as truth. And this wilderness problem is catastrophic for the traditional model we are told to take as truth, because the Mosaic Law required enormous numbers of livestock, not only for food, but for continual sacrificial offerings. Tens of thousands of animals per year were required, which also means a requirement of abundant grazing land and steady water sources. And again, the claimed biblical region cannot support the livestock populations of that magnitude today, nor is there any evidence that it ever could. Such biodiversity is simply impossible in the modern Middle East, and even secular historians would agree. This ecological contradiction becomes even more pronounced when we examine the specific wildlife Scripture treats as native and common. The biblical record speaks repeatedly of bears, lions, wolves, deer, wild oxen, and other large forest-dependent animals, not as rare or extraordinary creatures, but as familiar dangers and ordinary features of life. These animals appear across the law, the historical books, the Psalms, the books of wisdom, and the prophets without any explanation, indicating that the inspired authors assumed their audience lived in a land where such creatures naturally existed. Bears alone present a decisive problem for the Middle Eastern model. Bears require dense forests, expansive territorial ranges, reliable water sources, and cooler temperate climates. Scripture references bears multiple times as real threats, whether in historical accounts, prophetic imagery, or wisdom literature. Yet the modern Middle East contains no native bear populations capable of sustaining such descriptions, nor is there evidence that it ever supported bears in widespread or stable numbers. North America, however, historically supported extensive bear populations across forested regions that align precisely with the environment Scripture presupposes. The same is true of stags and hinds, which appear constantly throughout Scripture as a reflection of speed, grazing abundance, and open pasture land. These animals require large transitional zones between forest and grassland, seasonal migrations, and rich vegetation. The biblical land is depicted as supporting flocks, herds, and wild grazing animals simultaneously, which therefore directly demands an ecosystem of both scale and diversity. And North America possesses this naturally through its river-fed plains, forests, and expansive grasslands. The Middle Eastern landscape, even when projected backwards into antiquity, can under no circumstance sustain these ecological assumptions without continual artificial intervention. And the same ecological assumption appears repeatedly with eagles, which are presented as familiar and visible inhabitants of the land. They are referenced casually throughout the Old Testament, with detailed attention to their nesting behavior, hunting patterns, and use of high places. Eagles require expansive territories, elevated nesting zones, reliable water sources, and abundant prey, conditions that demand a land of scale and ecological richness. The modern Middle East does not support widespread native eagle populations capable of sustaining such ridings, nor does it provide the forests, the cliffs, and river systems required for their abundant presence. North America, by contrast, has of course historically and currently sustained vast eagle populations across river valleys, mountain ranges, forested regions, and coastlines, making the biblical use of eagles as a common and understood feature of the land both natural and expected. And with that said, I kindly ask you to take a moment to sit back and consider these points taken together, and see how these geographical and environmental contradictions reveal the following. The modern Middle East does not fit the descriptions given by the inspired authors. It lacks the forests, the rivers, the mountains, the fertility, the climate, and the scale of the land where the Israelites once set foot. And if the land cannot support the narrative, then the land cannot be the land we read about in the Bible. Before archaeology is even considered, based on these findings, it is my opinion that Scripture itself disqualifies the modern Middle East as the true setting of the biblical world. Even though we hold to a postmillennial worldview and understand that the Little Season reshaped geography and historical memory, the land itself will by some still expect to bear some archaeological record. Yet when we examine the biblical region today, the evidence is entirely silent. Again, there are no traces of a nation wandering for 40 years, no evidence of the large encampments described in the Old Testament, and no fortified cities matching the scale of Joshua's conquest. The sites assigned to Jericho, Hazor, and others do not fit the biblical descriptions or show no corresponding destruction layers at all. And it's definitely not that this silence challenged the scripture, but instead, it simply reveals that the events did not occur in the land they falsely call Israel today. The archaeology simply fails because the geography is wrong.